Good day, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk about homeschooling versus regular schooling today. It's a debate amongst a lot of Catholics. Some people view it as the most traditional way to educate your kids. Some people don't. And often tempers flare on either side of the equation. And I want to discuss that today. I'm going to do my best to make everybody happy, which means I'm probably going to make everybody mad. I hope not, but stay tuned. All right, before we begin, if I'm actually sitting in our homeschool room, so if you need if you need to move because you need more space to homeschool your kids or whatever, you're going to need to use a good Catholic real estate agent. You can find a link for that underneath Real Estate for Life. They set you up with someone who shares your Catholic faith to help you buy or sell the house, which is great because huge money purchases like that, you want to be with somebody who shares the same fundamental principles because it can get really dicey if you don't. And then also, if you do use a cell phone, which you probably do because you're alive in the year 2025, even a dumb phone. I have a flip phone now, but I still have a cell phone. You can go to iCatholic Mobile. The link for that is underneath. You've often probably supported causes because they support veterans or they're not woke or whatever, and that's great. But why not also support Catholics with your bills that you already have to pay? And a portion of what you pay for your cell phone bill will actually go to supporting traditional religious activities like nuns and priests and so forth in good traditional orders. And they even have ways to help you with parental controls and whatnot, which is extremely important if you have children. And the link for that is underneath iCatholic Mobile. Just tell them Kennedy sent you. Okay, so homeschooling. Well, homeschooling is something that is very common amongst faithful Catholics, not just traditional, but also in the sort of the Novus Ordo world. It's just, and also Protestants for that matter, for people who are very intentional about the education of their children, they often turn to homeschooling. And we homeschool basically out of necessity. We like it, but there's a necessity involved. There's just, quite frankly, no good school close to us that we could send our kids to. So it is what it is. Nonetheless, it is something that has become, I'm going to say in a sort of colloquial sense, meaning it's just kind of customary. People often associate homeschooling with like a really good Catholic family. You know, they're a really good Catholic family because they homeschool. And sometimes when parents make different decisions, it's not infrequent that they'll be looked on or looked at as someone who isn't kind of willing to put in the work because that's the best way to school your kids and so on and so forth. So I thought that we could take a quick look at church history and see how education has looked in the history of the church so we can have our fruitful discussion here. So I have here in front of me, I'll hold it up for the screen. This is the Catechism of the Council of Trent, the Roman Catechism. And this is the 10 books copy. I don't know if every reprint of this, because of course it's an old book, I don't know if every version has the same introduction, but in this one, in the introduction, I'll open it up for you here. It actually begins with a discussion, maybe you can see that, of catechetics during the early centuries, and it goes into catechetics in the Middle Ages and so on and so forth. And what's interesting about this, and I won't read too much of it, but it describes how in the beginning, whenever I say in the beginning, I want to say in the beginning was the word. But anyway, at the beginning of the church, there was a custom of basically catechizing the faithful, usually through Sunday catechism classes and sermons and things like that. That was how they got catechumens to understand the faith and whatnot. And then as the church becomes legalized, essentially, and is no longer persecuted, more robust institutions are set up. And if you read through this, you can actually find that as early as the 500s, there was a local council of Vaison, and this obliged the priests of Gaul to take boys into their household and teach them to read the Psalms and Holy Scriptures and to instruct them in the law of God. So that'd be something like, kind of the first instantiation of the professed religious running something like a Catholic school. And you see that continues in many local councils. In England in the 700s, the priests, it prescribed that the parish priest should always have in his house a school of learners and that he should not demand for this instruction any recompense from the parents, so free education to the kids. Likewise, in Orléans in France around the year 800, this local council decreed that Gratuitous instruction should be given by the priest in every town and village of his diocese. And it goes on to list more and more and more. Eventually we have sort of the more officialized school settings that become common. So if we think of the history of education as such, there's always been some form of education. Usually it was something that was reserved for not that many people. It was something reserved for those who basically had the means to do so. You have to understand that civilization for the longest time was very agrarian, and therefore huge amounts of work had to be done in the household. So the idea that you would send your kids off to learn for 5-6 hours a day rather than be at home helping with all the very arduous work that was necessary for everybody, that was just not something people could do unless they could do things like have servants and whatnot. So when you look at the academies in the sort of ancient Greek setting, you find that usually these are sort of the aristocracy, the upper crust of society as far as wealth and learning is concerned, and the mass of people aren't really getting that. Eventually, because of the genius, really, of the priesthood in many ways, you think about the reality that the priesthood is learned men who take vows of poverty, or at least they don't have to take them, but they sort of live detached from the world in some way. They have the ability to do so. And we see this education becoming more and more common. And eventually we find in the last couple centuries the vast networks of what we today consider Catholic schools. Now, granted, Catholic schools have really gone down the tubes in many places. Not all. There are still some good ones, for sure. But in many places, they've really gone down the tubes. So in the last 50, 60 years, the homeschooling movement has become a lot more common. And it's been very fruitful for many families. But is it traditionally what Catholics have done to educate their children? And the history tells us that it's not. Certainly, parents have always instructed their children in many things. Education does not just mean reading and writing. I may write books for a living and speak and whatnot, but I do have to have one of my good friends fix my car because I don't know how. So clearly I'm not that learned in certain areas, and other people are, which I appreciate. So there's many types of learning and things you have to know, and great skill sets and technical knowledge and whatnot. But as far as traditional schooling is concerned, you go there, you learn to read and write, you do mathematics and philosophy and all those sorts of things. That's something that was always done institutionally, and it wasn't something done at the home very much. And especially before the advent of the printing press, the likelihood of having books or written documents in your home was very rare. And this is one of the myths that Protestants will throw at Catholics, and they'll say, Catholics were chaining the Bible to desks so people couldn't read them. Well, it's true. When you would go into various libraries, Bibles were actually chained to desks because they would cost like the equivalent of something like $50,000 in our modern day, because they were written by hand and there weren't that many copies, so they were chained so nobody could steal them. But they were in libraries and houses of learning, and if you could read, you could go read them. There was no prohibition on that. That's just a stupid black legend. Protestantism kind of forgets that there was this thing called the printing press that was invented by Catholics just before Protestantism took off, and they took that and ran with it and then used that to rewrite history, or in a sense, kind of write it down for the first time for many, but wrongly, and confused a lot of people. But anyway, so education was always done through the priesthood and through the brothers and the nuns and so on and so forth. And then, as I said, schools started to go down the tubes largely after the Second Vatican Council, let's be honest. And there's more to it than that, but that was a big part of Catholic schools getting a lot worse, of course, of heresy and bad philosophy is running amok amongst those who are instructed with teaching your kids. Then, of course, your children are going to imbibe those things. And then, of course, a fall in morals and the wisdom of segregating boys and girls separately for education was thrown out the window. And now so many Catholic schools, sure, they have uniforms. Sure, there are crosses and crucifixes on the wall. Sure, they're called Jesuit or Catholic or Basilian or whatever. But they're essentially they're the functional equivalent of a public school as far as what the kids actually learn, but they just happen to have a religion class or something, which usually is in some ways worse than what they might learn at a public school about religion, because they're being taught bad theology rather than just general talking points about religion as such, and they become formed as bad Catholics, which is probably worse than not being formed at all. But anyway, that's another story for another day. So parents have turned to homeschooling. But is it the traditional way? No, it's not. So why is it that so many Catholics rely on it today? Well, again, for the reasons we've discussed, for circumstance. But there are difficulties with homeschooling that I think people need to be aware of. It takes a lot of time. It can be a not insignificant financial stressor for the family because, of course, mom's going to be home and not working, or even if we don't want our wives to leave the home to work, at least if she's not schooling, she has time for other stuff, and that contributes to the household economy and so forth. So it really does take away from a lot of things. It's very difficult for mothers to homeschool when they're having children. Mothers experience pregnancy and the aftermath of pregnancy, the postpartum stuff, in different ways that are unique to all, and there's really no way around that. If it happens, it happens, and it can make things difficult. And I think that we would do well as Catholics to recognize that while homeschooling can be excellent, and there is excellent homeschooling, for sure. We homeschool our children, and I think we do a pretty good job. And I much prefer it than the other options I have available. But the true traditional Catholic education was always done through the parish and was always done by usually professed religious, or most often young ladies or young men who weren't married yet, and so on and so forth. And there's a great value in that. There are certain things that are difficult to recreate in a home setting. Especially for young men, when they get to the ages of 12, 13, 14, it's my opinion that they really do require something like competition, something like a battle, because when they're in just a few short years, reaching the age of 17, 18, 19, 20, they've got to go off and sort of begin the next chapter of their life, whether that's entering the workforce or trades or higher education for something useful. When they do that, they're going to encounter a lot of problems. They're going to encounter a lot of bullies, basically, that if they don't have any experience with dealing with interpersonal conflict with people who are not their family members in a setting where there's a competitive spirit where excellence is required or expected, that can be difficult. And it's hard to recreate that in the home. It just is. It doesn't matter. You can be the best teacher, you can be the best parents, but there's just something about going out into the deep and experiencing that unknown, and having those competitions with groups of men that really does form you. And that is something homeschooling parents have to reconcile with. In addition, there are a lot of subjects that once you get to a certain level, it is difficult for parents to be able to provide a level of expertise that is commensurate or requisite for learning to a high degree, and that's why you want to have certain specialists. Furthermore, one of the temptations I've seen in homeschooling families is, let's be honest, a lot of parents kind of resign themselves to the fact that they have to homeschool their kids because sometimes there's no other option, and I get that. But their heart's not really in it. It's kind of like, this is something we have to do because the other option is not possible. So there's this element of looking at it as something kind of burdensome rather than something that is transformative. And when that happens, there is a temptation in homeschooling families to sort of make sure you have all the right books, make sure you have all the right videos and the right workbooks and things, and make sure you cross off all the prerequisites and they're educated. But education is more than that. It's difficult to transmit, to transmit to your children a love of learning, a love of higher thought, a love of rhetoric and philosophy and mathematics and all these kinds of things, if it's not something that you love as well. And it's also worth mentioning that this is a little bit sort of anecdotal side note, but if you look at the Society of St. Pius X, for example, vocations are much higher than you'll find in virtually every other, as far as, percentage of the population becoming priests. Vocations are skyrocketing compared to, and also nuns, I should say, but they're skyrocketing compared to, basically everybody else, almost. And the funny thing is that in some of the nations where most of the priests come from, so places like France and Switzerland, you're actually not allowed to homeschool in those countries. Certainly, they do have private schools set up for the kids, but it's also the case that in some cases, there are a number of priests in the society who went through the regular state school system and became traditional Catholic priests. And how is that possible? Well, there are a couple of reasons why. Number one, these traditional Catholics make sure that they sort of congregate in the same municipalities. So their children are all going to the same school. So they support each other and they are active within the school. So the teachers understand what the parents expect, which kind of brings down the woke a little bit, which is great. But also, if you're in a situation where you can't homeschool your children and you can't send them to a good school because, maybe you're a single dad and your wife has passed away or something and you have to work. I mean, these things happen. It's just the way it is. If you're in a situation like that, you also need not despair, because if you make it very clear to your children that you live the Catholic faith, that you are their primary teacher, that you're involved with their classroom, that you do a lot to form them outside of the school day, and you give them sort of the tools to navigate, you'd be surprised how well kids can do in even subpar environments. Of course, we wouldn't say these environments are ideal, but they do happen, and there's really nothing you can do about it in some circumstances. Think of certain countries where Catholicism is heavily suppressed, if not illegal. Certainly, they don't have Catholic schools, and usually in those places, there's not really anything such as homeschooling for a variety of economic and socio-political reasons. And kids are going to have to go to school in, bad places, but their children still grow up and believe the Catholic faith and they hold fast to it, because there's more than what happens just in the classroom. So ultimately, to conclude this sort of short monologue, I would say I love homeschooling. Homeschooling is great, but there are many options to educate your kids, and there isn't one way where it's like the perfect way. And everyone should have patience with one another for choosing different ways. And also, I know there are a lot of moms out there who have convinced themselves or with their spouse have been convinced that they should homeschool, but it's just dragging them down and it's just killing them. Don't beat yourself up. If you can find another option, go for it. In America, there are many educational options that I've seen people go through. I mean, there's charter schools and things like that. Are they perfect Catholic schools? No. But do they offer an excellent education and discipline and uniforms and manners and punctuality and all those kinds of things? Yes, they do. And they do get a top-notch education as far as education is concerned. And you can always fill in the gaps if you need to. As long as your children aren't being taught, horrendous anti-Catholic nonsense, you can make sure that they're catechized and you can make sure that they're formed for their sacraments and you can make sure they spend time in the church community and so forth. And that's going to have a huge effect on them as well. So there are many options, and parents need to be easier on themselves, I think, in some cases, and not beat themselves up. And we should all recognize that the path to becoming educated can be as unique as a tailored suit and really does have to fit the person. And we're not in a position to make judgments on others for choosing different paths because it is quite unique and individual. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have for you. God bless you all, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.